It always amazes me how a neighborhood can look so perfect from the outside and feel so suffocating once you're inside it. My street was lined with manicured hedges, identical mailboxes, and a glossy welcome sign that read, "Whispering Pines." But it wasn't the trees whispering. It was the residents, gossiping behind curtains, quick to report any minor infraction to the homeowners association. And presiding over all of it was Karen. Everyone knew her name even before they moved in. She had been HOA president for 8 years, re-elected by the same handful of loyal friends. She walked with her clipboard like a scepter, lips pinched tight as if she were constantly tasting something sour. If your grass grew a quarter-inch too high, you'd get a notice in your mailbox. If your shutters were the wrong shade of taupe, you'd get a fine. I used to think she did it out of boredom. Later, I realized it was about control. When I bought my house 2 years ago, I'd been through enough city apartments to crave quiet. The small backyard with its cedar fence was my sanctuary. Every nail I hammered into that fence felt like a promise to myself. Here, at least, no one could intrude. I kept my lawn neat, my trash cans hidden, my mailbox regulation height. I didn't want to be on Karen's radar, but she found me anyway. She left notes about my recycling bin being placed too early on collection day, about my porch light being too bright at night. I forced a polite smile and, "Yes, ma'am," every time she approached, but inside I simmered. It was a Saturday morning in early spring when everything snapped. The sun was barely up, a hazy gold spilling over the rooftops. I had just poured my first cup of coffee, planning to sit on the patio and enjoy the quiet. Then came the sound. A deafening, splintering crash, wood cracking, metal scraping, and a sharp yelp. My mug slipped from my hand and shattered on the tile. My heart jumped into my throat. I sprinted outside barefoot. The scene looked surreal. My beautiful fence, my one shield from the outside world, was caved in. Jagged boards jutted like broken bones. In the middle of my flower bed lay a bright red dirt bike, its front wheel bent at an ugly angle, the engine still sputtering. And standing next to it, helmet under one arm, was Karen's teenage son. He was tall and lanky, maybe 16, with that smugness some kids wear like armor. He glanced at me as if I were the intruder. Before I could even open my mouth, he barked, "You're paying for this! Your fence is a hazard." For a second, I thought I'd misheard. I stared at the splintered boards, at the tire tracks gouged into my grass, then back at him. "Excuse me?" I managed. He rolled his eyes, inspecting a tiny scrape on his arm. "My bike's wrecked because of your stupid fence. Mom says you have to pay." It was like stepping into an alternate universe. My fence was perfectly legal, inspected and approved when I bought the house. He had no right to be anywhere near it. Yet here he was blaming me. My pulse thudded in my ears. I felt heat rise up my neck, the way it does when you're too angry to speak. Karen appeared minutes later, storming across the lawn with her phone already in hand. "I'm calling the police," she announced without greeting me. "This fence is a safety hazard. My son could have been killed." I gestured to the scene. "He crashed into my fence. On my property. He's not even supposed to ride here." Karen ignored me, speaking loudly into her phone. "Yes, we need an officer. Private property, minor injured, illegal fence." She shot me a glare like a dagger. Her son smirked, cradling his arm dramatically. I could see the performance now, injured victim, evil neighbor. It might have even worked on someone who didn't know better. I took a slow breath. "I'll call the police myself," I said, pulling out my own phone. My hands trembled so hard I almost dropped it. Inside my head, a voice screamed, "Stay calm." Facts first. No shouting. When the patrol car arrived 10 minutes later, it felt like an eternity. Neighbors peeked through blinds. Karen launched into her story before the officer even closed his door, waving her arms, describing my fence as illegally tall and unmarked like it was a barbed wire trap. Her son nodded solemnly, clutching his arm. I waited until she finished, then handed the officer my property survey, HOA approval letters, and the code section allowing my fence height. I'd kept them in a folder precisely because of Karen's constant threats. My voice shook, but I forced it steady. "This is my fence. It's fully compliant. He rode onto my property without permission and crashed into it." The officer examined the dirt bike. His brow furrowed. "Is this registered?" he asked the kid. The boy mumbled something. Karen jumped in. "It's just a dirt bike. He rides it all the time. That's not the issue." But it was the issue. The officer called in the VIN. No registration. No insurance. Not street legal. He straightened up, his voice calm but firm. Ma'am, your son was operating an unregistered motor vehicle on private property. He caused property damage. This is not this gentleman's liability. Karen's face drained of color. That's ridiculous, she snapped. He's just a kid. I understand, the officer said, but the law applies. He called for a tow truck. The boy's bravado crumbled. You can't take my bike, he wailed. Karen's voice pitched higher. You can't tow it. We'll sue. The officer didn't argue. He just stepped back and began writing his report. Watching him was like feeling a storm pass and the air clear. My hands stopped shaking. I could breathe again. When the tow truck arrived, it was almost cinematic. The operator rolled up, unhurried, and began winching the dirt bike onto the flatbed. The boy's eyes welled. Karen sputtered threats about lawyers, about knowing people, but no one listened. I stood quietly, arms crossed, heart pounding but steady. Inside, though, a fierce relief bloomed. For once, someone in authority saw through the lies. The truck pulled away with the red bike chained tight. The sound of the ratchet clicking felt like punctuation. Click, click, justice. Karen turned on me, her voice a hiss now instead of a shriek. This isn't over, she muttered, dragging her son toward their house. But her shoulders sagged. She knew it was over. In the days that followed, the HOA fell silent. No more notes about my recycling bin. No more citations. It was as if Karen's clipboard had lost its power. She avoided me at the mailbox. Her son disappeared from the cul-de-sac. The hole in my fence gaped like a missing tooth, but I left it for a week, a visible reminder of what had happened. Finally, an official HOA check arrived in the mail with a curt apology letter. Per our investigation, the association will cover the cost of your fence repair. No signature from Karen, just the HOA letterhead. I took the check and hired a contractor to install a new section of cedar, stronger than before. Every time I looked at it, it felt like a trophy. But even as I enjoyed the quiet, I kept thinking back to that morning. The crash, the accusations, the trembling in my hands. That's the thing about injustice. It seeps into your body, makes you doubt yourself. Standing there while someone lies about you to the police, you start to wonder if truth matters at all. Watching that tow truck roll away proved it still does. After the tow truck rolled off and the neighborhood slowly swallowed the morning's drama, I went back inside and closed the door. The house felt strangely quiet, like the air after a thunderclap. I sat on the edge of the sofa staring at my empty hands. They were still marked with faint crescents from my own nails. That was the first time in years I'd been accused of something so baldly false and had no one around to back me up. Even though the officer had sided with me, I felt wrung out, my chest hollow. As the day stretched on, texts from neighbors began trickling in. Some were curious, some sympathetic, but none wanted to be quoted. Everyone knew how vindictive Karen could be. One neighbor whispered that Karen had already started telling people I set a trap with my fence to injure her son. Another said she was bragging about pressing charges soon. I kept my replies short. My gut said the best thing I could do now was stay absolutely boringly calm and keep my documentation neat. I spent that evening walking the perimeter of my yard, taking photos of every angle of the damage. Each click of my phone felt like a small act of self-protection. The boards of the fence were splintered and deep ruts carved through my flower bed where the dirt bike had skidded. My tulips were flattened like trampled flags. It looked less like an accident and more like a deliberate incursion. The more I looked, the more a slow anger simmered under my exhaustion. Over the next few days, the street had a new hush. Karen's usual clipboard rounds stopped. The HOA newsletter that always carried her president's message arrived with a blank space where her note usually went. People walked their dogs a little faster past my house. Children kept to the far side of the street. It was as if my yard had become the Bermuda Triangle of whispering pines. At night, I lay awake replaying the scene. Her son's smirk, her accusing tone, my own trembling hands. It wasn't just about offense. It was about being accused, inverted, treated as guilty for defending my own property. I thought of every small indignity from the past year, the notes about my porch light, the citations for leaving a rake leaning against the house for too long. All the while, Karen's own lawn furniture sat out past the deadline. Her friends' trash cans cluttered the street. Rules for thee, not for me. By midweek, an envelope slid under my door. No stamp, no address. Inside was a single sheet of paper. We know what you're doing. Drop it or else. No signature. Just block letters in black marker. My stomach lurched. It could have been anyone, but I knew who had a history of petty intimidation. My first impulse was to crumple it. Instead, I photographed it and added it to my growing file. I decided to meet with a lawyer. Not to sue yet, but to know my rights. Sitting in that small office with a row of law books behind him, the attorney nodded as I laid out the story. "You're doing the right thing," he said. "Document everything. Don't engage directly. Let them hang themselves with their own rope." His calmness was a balm. He even called the police station to confirm the incident report. Karen's son, unregistered vehicle, property damage, bike impounded. Everything neatly in black and white. That night, I sat on my patio under the faint glow of my too bright porch light and thought about boundaries, literal and metaphorical. People like Karen thrived on intimidation. Every time I'd smiled and said, "Yes, ma'am," she'd taken it as permission to push further. Maybe the fence wasn't just wood. Maybe it was my own line in the sand finally being crossed. 2 days later, a different patrol car rolled down the street and stopped in front of my house. My pulse spiked, but when the officer knocked, he was polite. "Just wanted to let you know," he said, "there's no basis for any complaint against you. We've closed the matter." I thanked him, relief loosening a knot between my shoulder blades. He hesitated on the porch. "Off the record," he added, "be careful. Some folks don't like being embarrassed." Then he tipped his hat and left. Embarrassed. That was the word. I pictured Karen watching the tow truck haul away her son's bike in front of half the street. Her power, her image of control, cracked in an instant. No wonder she'd gone quiet. But shame has a way of mutating. I needed to be ready. On Friday, the HOA board sent me an email. They would cover the cost of fence repair as a goodwill gesture. That meant Karen had lost. The board rarely overruled her. I clicked reply and attached an estimate from a reputable contractor, double the cost of the original section because I was upgrading to reinforced posts. Within an hour, they approved it. Watching the contractor tear out the broken boards and set new cedar posts felt cathartic. The smell of fresh wood filled the air, sharp and clean. The new section stood taller, straighter, and stronger than before. I ran my hand along the smooth grain. It wasn't just a fence anymore. It was a monument to holding the line. Still, the part of me that had been shaking that Saturday morning didn't vanish overnight. I found myself rehearsing what I'd say if Karen confronted me again. Imagining her son trying to retrieve his bike. Even picturing worst-case scenarios, a rock thrown through my window, a bogus complaint to city inspectors. Hypervigilance is hard to switch off once it's on. A week later, I was hauling groceries from my car when I heard footsteps behind me. Karen stood at the edge of my driveway, hands empty for once. No clipboard. She looked smaller than usual, shoulders rounded, eyes avoiding mine. "About the fence," she said stiffly. "It was a misunderstanding." I let the silence stretch. She cleared her throat. "We didn't realize the bike wasn't registered." "It won't happen again." Her son hovered a few feet back, scuffing his sneaker against the curb. Something in me wanted to lash out, to list every petty complaint she'd ever filed, every smirk, every threat. Instead, I just said, "Thank you for covering the repairs." My voice was even, almost gentle. She nodded quickly, color rising in her cheeks, and turned away. That was the last real conversation we ever had. Inside, though, the adrenaline still hummed. I realized the real revenge wasn't the bike being towed or the check for the fence. It was the quiet, the sudden absence of her power over me. That was what justice felt like. Not fireworks, but the slow uncoiling of a spring wound too tight. In the weeks that followed, the street began to thaw. At first it was subtle, a wave from the retired couple across the way, a kid's basketball bouncing back into my driveway instead of being hurriedly retrieved. People began lingering at the mailbox again. The invisible quarantine around my house dissolved bit by bit. I could almost hear the collective recalibration, neighbors realizing that Karen's word wasn't law, that someone had finally stood their ground and survived. For me, the tension unwound slowly. The first night I slept without waking at every creak felt like stepping into warm sunlight after a long tunnel. My shoulders unclenched. I stopped checking the security camera feed on my phone every hour. Even my dog seemed to sense it, lounging in the yard instead of barking at every passerby. But the biggest change was inside me. Before the crash, I had walked on eggshells, bending to every rule to avoid conflict. Now, after weathering Karen's storm, something inside had shifted. I caught myself standing a little straighter, speaking with more certainty. At work, I negotiated harder. At the store, I returned a defective item without apologizing. Holding the line over a fence had taught me I could hold the line anywhere. The new section of cedar weathered into a rich honey color. I planted new tulip bulbs along its base, bright reds and oranges that would blaze in spring. Each time I pressed a bulb into the soil, I thought of that Saturday morning, the crash, the smirk, the tow truck, and felt a quiet satisfaction. Not triumph, exactly. More like restoration. Karen, meanwhile, faded from her role as queen of the cul-de-sac. She still attended HOA meetings, but the board now shared announcements instead of deferring to her. The newsletter began including rotating columns from different residents. A new volunteer headed the landscaping committee. Whispering Pines started to feel less like her kingdom and more like an actual community. One afternoon, about a month after the incident, I was pruning a shrub when a man I didn't recognize walked up the driveway. He introduced himself as the father of one of Karen's board allies. "Just wanted to say," he murmured, glancing around, "that what you did, standing up like that, it helped more people than you know. We've all been tired of her antics." Then he tipped his cap and left before I could answer. I stood there holding my clippers, surprised by a wave of warmth. All this time I'd thought I was fighting a solitary battle over a fence. In reality, I'd been part of a quiet rebellion, one act of pushback that gave others permission to push back too. There were still flickers of the old Karen. I'd see her son riding a bicycle, the pedal-powered kind now, down the far end of the street. Head ducked. Occasionally, a terse email from the HOA would land in my inbox, nitpicking some triviality, but the edge was gone. No threats, no fines, just paper tigers. Sometimes I wondered what had gone through Karen's mind that day, watching the tow truck haul away her son's pride and joy. Embarrassment, certainly, but maybe also a glimmer of recognition, realizing that power abused eventually snaps back. I'll never know. We became polite strangers, orbiting each other with cautious neutrality. The bigger lesson, though, was about justice itself. Revenge stories online often show spectacular takedowns, public humiliations, lawsuits won. In my case, the payoff was quieter but deeper. It wasn't about punishing Karen. It was about reclaiming my peace. The real victory was waking up on a Saturday, sipping coffee on my patio, and knowing my boundaries held. One crisp morning in late fall, I sat outside watching the leaves drift down. A breeze carried the scent of cedar and earth. My dog dozed at my feet. Across the street, kids chalked hopscotch squares on the pavement, their laughter high and free. For the first time since moving in, Whispering Pines actually whispered, not with gossip, but with ordinary neighborhood life. I thought back to that first moment of impact, the crash, the splintering wood, my heart hammering. I remembered the tremor in my hands as Karen accused me, the officer's calm voice, the ratchet of the tow chain. Each detail had etched itself into me like grooves on vinyl. And now, playing back, it made a different song, one of boundaries held, truth recognized, and a community quietly shifting toward fairness. If someone had told me then that a wrecked fence and a dirt bike would change how I saw myself, I'd have laughed. But here I was, stronger in ways I hadn't expected. I wasn't just the homeowner who kept his yard neat to avoid trouble. I was someone who could face it head-on and come out the other side steadier. Occasionally, new families moved in, and I'd see them glance nervously at the HOA rules, at the neatly trimmed hedges. Sometimes they'd ask me about the president in hushed tones. I'd smile and say, "The HOA is fine. Just keep your fence up to code." And inside I'd feel that quiet ripple of satisfaction, knowing the myth had cracked. The tulips bloomed that spring in fierce red and orange, little flames against the cedar. Neighbors stopped to compliment them. Kids leaned on the fence to pet my dog. The scar of the crash had become a story, and the story had become a lesson. Stand your ground, document the truth, stay calm, and sometimes the universe, or at least a tow truck, will show up right on time. As for Karen's son, the last I heard he'd sold what was left of the dirt bike to pay off a fine. Maybe he learned something about boundaries too. Maybe not. But I no longer flinched when I heard an engine revving in the distance. It was just noise now, not a threat. Looking back, the moment that stays with me isn't the towing or the check, or even Karen's grudging apology. It's the instant the officer said, "This is not your liability," and my body unclenched. That was the hinge where the whole story turned. That was the payoff every person who's been wrongly accused longs for, someone in authority finally seeing the truth. Now, when I tell friends about it, they lean forward, eyes wide. "So they towed his bike?" they ask. And I smile, sip my coffee, and say, yes, they did. And in that simple sentence is all the catharsis I need. Sometimes revenge is loud. Sometimes it's the sound of a tow chain clicking. And sometimes it's just silence. No more notes on the door, no more smirks over the hedge, no more walking on eggshells in your own yard. Just peace. And that peace, after everything, is the sweetest payback of all.